Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of 1990's Represent. We're still in our third cycle of 1992, talking about a movie this episode. In this episode, we're talking about Reservoir Dogs. So, the feature length debut of Quentin Tarantino. Absolutely one of my favorite writers and directors. First film I saw of his was Pulp Fiction. And then I think after that it was like Jackie Brown, I think, and then a couple others. Saw Kill Bill 1 and 2. I didn't see Reservoir Dogs right away. I want to say it was probably after Kill Bill 2 came out, so like maybe like 2004, maybe 2005 is when I actually first watched it. Very good movie. I don't think it's his best, but it definitely is a very strong kind of start for his directorial debut there, or feature debut. Very good movie overall. It's got a great cast. I got some notes here about it. We're gonna go through those notes, and then we're going to get to the plot and all that as well. So that's what we have here. Grab this. So Reservoir Dogs, first released, at least in wide release, October 9th, 1992. However, it did premiere at Sundance January 21st of 1992. Empire rated this as their, quote, greatest independent film of all time. It's definitely it definitely kind of came out at a time where independent film was really starting to kind of take off. I remember seeing I think Pulp Fiction would probably still count as being generally independent. And then, directors like Tarantino were kind of emerging, Robert Rodriguez. So a very interesting time in kind of film like that. So this came out, like I said, 1992. Pulp Fiction was a couple years later. I remember there was I think 4 Rooms. I remember seeing that. That was a couple years after that. The great cast. Let me actually bring the cast up here. The cast in this movie is just incredible. Let me actually just bring up the cast here. So we're just going to go down the cast list here. You have Harvey Keitel as Mr. White. You have Tim Roth as Mr. Orange. Michael Madsen as Mr. Blonde. Chris Penn as Nice Guy Eddie. Steve Buscemi as Mr. Pink. Probably my favorite character in the movie. Lawrence Tierney as Joe. Randy Brooks as Holiday or Holdaway. Kirk Baltz as Marvin Nash. That's the cop that Mr. Blonde is interrogating and torturing. You have Edward Bunker as Mr. Blue. Quentin Tarantino as Mr. Brown. Let's see, David Steen and Stephen Wright are also in this movie. Stephen Wright doing the voice of K. Billy, the DJ, who's talking about Steelers Wheel and all that kind of stuff. So just an amazing cast, great chemistry between all of the characters. Like I said, Mr. Pig is probably my favorite, but Harvey Keitel is really good. Michael Madsen is really good. Tim Roth is really good. There's some interesting Tim Roth information we'll get to a little bit later in the video. Tarantino's not a great actor. He has a very interesting monologue about like a virgin by Madonna. That's kind of one of the iconic kind of scenes there. Just the dialogue, Tarantino's dialogue is just always on point. I think his dialogue has gotten better and better, but it just feels very natural. When they're having breakfast, the conversations they're having about Madonna's music is great. Mr. Pink talking about not tipping. All the kinds of conversations you have between Mr. White and Mr. Pink when they're at the warehouse. It's just all his dialogue always just feels very, very natural. It almost reminds me of back when we did the Out of Sight video, and Elmore Leonard was talking about if my writing seems like writing, I throw it away. So I think Tarantino kind of follows that kind of writing style, where if what he's writing feels like writing, he won't go with it. But he has all this stuff that just feels very natural and very organic. It's probably my favorite thing about his movies is his dialogue and how it just feels like it kind of very well, perfectly fits with what's going on in the movie there. Let's see here. We got that. A lot of Tarantino's kind of stylistic choices you can see in this movie. There's like a trunk shot where I think Mr. Pink, Mr. Blonde, and Mr. White open a trunk. That's where they have. That's where Mr. Blonde has stashed the police officer that he's got. So that trunk shot you again see later in Pulp Fiction. I think you definitely see it in some of his other stuff. Um, Out of order storytelling is a kind of like a hallmark of Tarantino. In this movie, you see they basically go to breakfast. You don't see it then cuts to Mr. Blonde and Mr. Orange driving back to the rendezvous point, and then you see kind of the backstory of Mr. I think it goes. I think Mr. White's is first. I'm not sure if it's Mr. White or Mr. Blonde, but basically, Mr. White, Mr. Blonde, and Mr. Orange all get like flashbacks of what they were doing like prior to the kind of robbery. Michael Madsen's character gets brought into an office where he's getting like Chris Penn and Lawrence Tierney talking to him. You see Tim Roth's character talking to I think like an undercover like cop, and he's basically saying like you got to have like your backstory, your commode story, and all that kind of stuff. So the kind of out of order storytelling of Tarantino is on display in this movie as well. Like Pulp Fiction, it happens in Pulp Fiction. I believe it happens in Jackie Brown, even though Jackie Brown is not entirely a Tarantino original. It's based on an Elmore Leonard book. But I think like Inglourious Basterds has some out of order stuff in it. A lot of Tarantino's work like has that, and it all kind of started with this movie here, which is really cool. Basically, Tarantino was working at like a video store and was planning on filming this movie on a like $30,000 budget. I think they were talking about doing it in like 16 millimeter, like maybe even black and white, with a budget of like $30,000. Lawrence Bender, the producer of the movie, who also has produced a bunch of other stuff with Tarantino, gave the script to his acting teacher, and that acting teacher then in turn gave the script over to Harvey Keitel. Harvey Keitel then signed on to be a co-producer of the movie, so that was able to get them some more funding. I think like it also allowed them to do some casting calls in like New York City. So basically, like he was able to help secure a bigger budget for the film. Tim Roth's, I guess his agent wanted him to play Mr. Pink, but I think Tim Roth was also wanting to play Mr. Orange because like the acting showcase on display from what this is, there's this quote. Don't know if it's a quote. Let me actually just bring it up here. Let me just see here. All right, here we go. So yeah, so Tim Roth's agent wanted to have Mr. Pink, but I think Tim Roth wanted to do Mr. Orange because this is a quote from I don't know if it's a quote from Tim Roth, but basically he would be quote he would be an English actor pretending to be an American, playing a cop pretending to be a robber. So that's like 4 layers like in acting. Like you have Tim Roth who's English playing an American. That's not super uncommon. Like Christian Bale's really good at it. Tim Roth's really good at it. But he's playing an English actor playing an American who is then playing a like an undercover cop pretending to be a robber. That is so cool. I think. Steve Buscemi is on point in this movie. I think my first movie I saw was Steve Buscemi in it. I guess technically was probably Pulp Fiction, even though he's barely in that. He's like the waiter at Jackrabbit Slim's. And then I remember seeing him in the next movie I think I saw him in was this is all before I had seen Reservoir Dogs, but this was he was in Desperado. Like I think he comes in, tells a story about like the Desperado about Antonio Banderas' character to like a bar. So I think I saw him in that, and then don't know, but he's been in just like a ton of stuff like Con Air and a bunch of just other like amazing movies. Steve Buscemi again is just like great in this. It's kind of interesting that all the characters really kind of screw up. Steve Buscemi is the only one that kind of tries to keep it together. Like Mr. White kind of like breaks the rule of telling Mr. Orange's name. Mr. Orange ends up then, at one point, it won't cover more until we get to the plot, ends up shooting Mr. Blonde, so that kind of blows his cover because like Chris Penn is like, hey, this guy went to jail for us and like he didn't rat us out for 4 years. Like, why would I believe you over him kind of thing? And then who else was there? So Mr. White gives his name to Mr. Orange. Mr. Orange kind of blows his cover by shooting Mr. Blonde. Mr. Blonde kind of definitely screws up by like basically if what Mr. White is telling you is the truth about when the alarm gets killed or switched or tripped at the jewelry store or the diamond wholesaler. Mr. Blonde is just killing everybody, so he messes up there. Um, Steve Buscemi is the only one that feels like he's kind of like somewhat in control of the situation. I don't really know if that's accurate, but that's kind of the way I got it. Like where he's just like, hey, like let's like work together and get the way out. And he's kind of like trying to like talk like sense into like some of them like toward the end of the movie. But Steve Buscemi is amazing in this. We got the Tim Roth thing. Let's see here. Oh yeah, so basically like there's this whole central thing to the movie is this kind of a failed diamond heist basically, and the whole thing goes terribly wrong. Like basically like police show up like immediately, but it's really cool because they don't show the robbery really at all. Like they show some of the aftermath, like when there's like a shootout like in front of it, and then you see like Steve Buscemi's character escaping. Apparently, that was done for two reasons. One reason was to keep the budget low because if they actually did the robbery, like filmed that kind of stuff, they would have to probably get like a whole new like location to film in, like other actors and stuff like that. So it kept the budget low. But then also it just kept the kind of movie like a little bit like ambiguous because you don't know exactly what happened. You're kind of filling in the kind of like the details in your head. As like for example, when Harvey Keitel is telling like I think he was telling who's he telling like he was telling Steve Buscemi, but he's like when he's like walking, he's like this is what's happening. He was like bam, bam. No, he's telling this guy Eddie, I think. But so you're basically kind of picturing the robbery in your head. So them not filming it like works on that because it kind of keeps it kind of vague, which is pretty cool. So we got that the robbery. One of the scenes that gets talked about a lot, or probably like the scene that gets talked about the most in this movie, is the scene between Mr. Blonde and the police officer, where Michael Madsen is dancing around the Steelers wheel, like torturing this cop, like cutting his ear off. Apparently, like during screenings, and I think like I'll get to a quote from Tarantino about that in a moment. It's kind of a rough scene to watch. Even though he's torturing the guy, and you see him. He like takes like the kind of the straight razor and like slices the guy's ear off. You don't actually see him slice it off. It pans the camera like pans away, and you just hear like Michael Madsen's like quit moving, like quit like doing this. And the guy is screaming. It also makes it probably like worse because you don't actually see it, and then it cuts back and you see him holding his ear, and then Michael Madsen. It's kind of funny. He's like joking. He's like, what was that? He's like, can you? He's like, I don't know. Can you hear that? It's really bad joke about getting his ear cut off. But apparently, like a lot of people left the screening during that because it's kind of a hard scene to watch. But I think people were telling Tarantino to take it as a compliment. And there is a quote from Tarantino here we're going to get to about that. Let's see, critical reception. Um, Let me just see where that. Yeah, because he was kind of told to take it as a compliment, and then this is about people walking out, and Tarantino was quoted as saying, he says, "quote It happens at every single screening. For some people, the violence or the rudeness of the language is a mountain they can't climb. That's okay. It's not their cup of tea, but I am affecting them. I wanted that scene to be disturbing, and it's definitely probably like once the first time you see it, it's definitely disturbing. I think now it's a little bit more." Like it's I don't know why I find it funny. It's like just because like the way like Michael Madsen is like talking into the guy's ear after he's like holding it. He's just like, "Can you hear this?" And then he's like just dancing around the Steelers wheel while he's like torturing this guy. And like the way he's dancing is like it's kind of humorous now, but it's definitely a very kind of rough scene. But and then he's like gonna torture the cop even worse by like burning him up or whatever. But that scene is definitely rough to watch, and I don't know, like the Steelers Wheel by, or Stuck in the Middle with You by Steelers Wheel. I don't know where that song would be right now without this movie because I probably wouldn't have known what that song was without this scene. Like, and just like the music in the movie, again, is on point. Tarantino is always very good about selecting like really good music for his movies. Like the Pulp Fiction soundtrack is incredible. Even like the Once Upon a Time in Hollywood soundtrack is really good. One of my favorites is the Inglorious Bastard soundtrack, as it uses stuff from like other like it uses like a David Bowie song, even though it's a World War II movie, and it fits very well. So like the soundtrack to this one is also really good. But now we're gonna get to the plot of this movie. So um, basically, it just starts off at a like a diner. They're all eating breakfast, drinking coffee. Tarantino's character, Mr. Brown, is talking about his interpretation from like a virgin. They're talking about like he's like, hey, I'm not gonna like quote the entire thing, but they're talking about that. And this is basically right before they go out and they're trying to do the heist. They're all wearing like like suits with black ties, sunglasses, very stylish. But Lawrence Tierney's character Joe, he's like, all right, I'm gonna get breakfast. You guys get the tip. It should be about $1 a piece, and everybody throws in $1, except for Mr. Pink, who's like, I don't tip, I don't believe in it. He's like, if somebody goes above and beyond, I might throw him a little bit extra. But he goes on to this whole speech about like he's like well like I worked at like a I worked when I was that age, and I didn't work a job that was like deemed tip worthy. He's like, well, and then they're all trying to convince him to tip, and he's like, well, you don't tip at McDonald's. But he's like, why does this group here say tip these people, but not these people? So he goes on this whole like his rant about tipping. Joe comes back. He's like, who didn't throw it? They're like, Mr. Pink. He's like, why not? He's like, he doesn't believe in it. And he's like, normally I would. And he eventually does tip, but he's like, never mind what you normally would do. Anyway, then they go do the heist. Goes to the credits. Cuts to a scene where now Mr. Orange is in the back of a car, just bleeding everywhere. He's been shot, of course. And Mr. White is trying to comfort him. He's like, don't worry. We'll get to the warehouse. We'll get to the rendezvous. We're gonna get this thing taken care of. You're not gonna die. Like, don't worry about it. They get there, and he's just trying to comfort him. And then Mr. Pink shows up, and Mr. Pink is like, man, we were set up. Those cops were there right. They were there right away. He's like, or there's like a line where he's like, where I think Mr. White's like, he's like, you think we were set up? And Mr. Pink's like, he's like, I don't think we were set up. I know we were set up. And Mr. Blonde at this point, I think, or not Mr. Blonde, Mr. Orange is like passed out. And they're talking about kind of like, well, what do we do? He's like, well, like Mr. Orange wants me to take him to a hospital. We can just drop him there. Like, but then he's like, but then at that point he's like, well, now like he's like Mr. Blonde is like, I think Mr. White's about to tell him his name is Mr. Blonde's like, don't tell me, or Mr. Pink's like, don't tell me your name. I don't want to know it. And then he's like, it kind of comes out that Mr. White told Mr. Orange what his name was. And he's like, what else did he tell me? He's like, oh, where I'm from. And he's like, well, now he's like, do you have a sheet on where you're from? He's like, probably. He's like, well, now this guy knows your name. He's like, he knows where you're from. And then basically, like, they can probably, like, pinpoint you that way. Mr. Blonde eventually shows up. And Mr. White has kind of been complaining about Mr. Blonde's kind of, like, just going, like, on, like, a murdering rampage at the store after the alarm went off. And he's like, hey, I told them not to pull the alarm, and they did. And then they're arguing. Mr. Blonde just walks in like drinking like a soda. It's kind of like a fast food soda. They're like they're all yelling at each other, like arguing. And he's like, "Are you gonna bark all day, little dog? You're gonna bite." And he's like, "What?" And they're getting ready to fight. He's like, "I got something in my car you might want to see." They pull a cop out, and this cop is like all like beat up. It does show Mr. Pink's escape. So basically, he's running down the street like shooting at people, like steals a car. But they go there and they have this cop like is like their hostage. They basically Mr. Pink has stashed the diamonds at this point, so they go get like Mr. White and Mr. Pink go to get the diamonds, and they leave Mr. Blonde with this cop. During the flashbacks, it shows flashbacks of kind of Mr. White working with Joe, and then there's another flashback of Mr. Blonde showing up at Joe's office, and nice guy Eddie's there, and Mr. Blonde has just basically got out of prison. He's like, hey, we'll get you a job working on the docks. Don't worry, it's not a real job. Basically, like, you'll just get clocked in and out. Basically, so your parole officer will, like, get off your back, basically. Cuts back to the warehouse, and then, like, everybody goes, and they leave to get the diamonds. Mr. Blonde then starts basically doing the whole torture scene where he, like, puts on the radio. He's like, hey, what do you think of K. Billy's cool like sounds in the 70s, and he pulls like a straight razor out and starts torturing the guy. After he cuts his ear off and is like slicing him up, he goes out to his car and gets a can of gas, and he's pouring gas all over him. I don't. Yeah, so Mr. Blonde is definitely kind of like the psychopath because at this point, if he lights him on fire, he may even just like burn the entire like building down. Cop is like pleading for like pleading and like I think Michael Madsen even was like the line about the cop having a kid was ad libbed by the actor playing the cop, which is crazy. And even Michael Madsen was like, he's like, yeah, that wasn't like scripted and that was kind of hard to film. But he's pouring gas all over them. At this point, Mr. Orange is kind of like has regained consciousness enough that he shoots Mr. Blonde like 5 or 6 times. And then he basically tells the police officer, he's like, hey, I'm a cop too. Like, don't worry. He's like, we'll like figure this out. I don't remember exactly what it's saying. And then it cuts to Mr. Orange's backstory, where he is basically going to be going undercover for the LAPD into this kind of like this robbery. And this guy he's working with, he's like, you need to like have a commode story where basically you have this background about you go to the bathroom, make up the details, and make up the story. He's telling Joe and Eddie the story about like how he went into a bathroom, like a train. I think it was on a train, or maybe he's like doing some stuff with like marijuana for like a friend of his. And he's like, I go into the bathroom. There's like 4 cops in there with like a German Shepherd, and I think I'm gonna get busted. And then the cops are just like talking amongst each other. So it cuts back after that, back to the warehouse. Everybody shows back up. So Mr. White shows back up. Mr. Pink shows back up, and so does nice guy Eddie. And he's like, "What the hell happened here?" He's like, "Why is like Mr. Blonde shot?" And then Mr. Orange is like, "Well, he was gonna burn this guy alive. He was gonna kill this guy. He was gonna like he was gonna kill him, and then he was gonna wait for you guys to get back, and then he was gonna kill you." And nice guy Eddie's like, "Oh, this cop here." He pulls the gun out and shoots the cop, actually killing him. But shoots him, and then he's like, "Well, Mr. Blonde, I've known this guy for years, and he went to jail for 4 years, and all he had to give them was my dad's name, and he didn't. He didn't rat us out for that amount of time. Why should I take your word over his?" And then Joe shows up. Joe then has realized that Mr. Orange is working for the police as well, and this is when you get to the iconic Mexican standoff where you got Harvey Keitel pointing, or Mr. White pointing a gun at Joe. You got Joe pointing a gun at Mr. Orange, and then you got nice guy Eddie pointing a gun at Mr. White. And he's like, Mr. White is like, "Hey, if you shoot Mr. Orange, I'm shooting you next." And then this guy Eddie's like, "Hey, stop pointing that gun at my dad." Like stop pointing it at him and all that. And then at some point, then Joe shoots Mr. Orange. In retaliation, Mr. White shoots Joe. And then nice guy Eddie shoots Mr. White. And I think as Mr. White is falling to the ground, he shoots nice guy Eddie. So basically, they all kill each other. Mr. Pink is still there, but he's been hiding under the ramp. He basically grabs the bag of diamonds and leaves. And then you see basically like police come in, and Harvey Keitel is in there, Mr. White, and he's been shot. He's basically like, and I think it's implied that he gets shot as well because he's kind of there with Mr. Orange, who's now pretty much who's dead at this point. But you see Steve Buscemi's character leave, and I would just like to think that Steve Buscemi's character escaped. I think they did a video game, and I remember actually looking up Mr. Pink's wiki page or whatever it was. And I guess like depending on what like difficulty you're playing as, or what like there's like different modes of the game. I never played the Reservoir Dogs game. I might actually try to find that somehow because I think it was on like PS2 and maybe Xbox, like the original Xbox. But I think there is one scenario where Mr. Pink escapes. I think like he drops the bag of diamonds to go everywhere. He hides under a car and like leaves or something. And there's also another scenario where he gets shot. So basically, you do hear the police come, and it's implied that he either is Mr. Pink is either like shot and killed or gets like arrested. But in the video game, there's a version where he survives. I kind of like to think that Mr. Pink got out just because he's the one that's kind of like he isn't as emotional as the other characters. He's definitely like feels like he's more like calculated and has stuff planned out better. So I kind of just like feel like it would be like it. I would like the idea that he gets away with it, but who knows? But anyway, just an amazing film. It's not my favorite Tarantino film. Probably my top three are probably like Pulp Fiction. I think Pulp Fiction, Inglourious Bastards, and maybe Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. But this is a really good one. There's some movies I think this is better than like some of his other stuff too. So I think it's like better than Death Proof. Not sure if I like it more than some. It's like it definitely is rough around the edges because it's his first, and he's definitely refined his craft over the years. So it's definitely kind of like a good starting point for him, but he's definitely made better films overall. I think there's some of his films I like a little bit less as well, but that is going to, I think, do it for this episode. We'll be back again in a few days. We'll be doing a video game from 1992, and then we will be moving into 1993, and then the rest of the decade after that. But yeah, Reservoir Dogs is a blast. I watched it on Amazon. I own it on Amazon Prime, but I highly recommend it. Definitely check it out. But again, that's going to do it for now. So remember to like, comment, share, subscribe. We'll see you again next time. Thanks again for watching. Take care and have a good one.